Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're looking at a proof, or at least a purported proof, of moral realism. We're going to be asking the question, can you prove moral realism from the armchair? So just a few notes before we get started. First, while I'm going to be criticizing an argument for moral realism in this video, I'm a moral realist, okay? Merely from the fact that someone says an argument for P fails, that doesn't commit that person to the negation of P, right? So if, for instance, you believe that God exists, well, presumably you think, or at least you should think, that the following argument fails. Premise one, God exists. Conclusion, God exists. Fails in the sense of it shouldn't convince anyone who doesn't antecedently accept the conclusion. That's what I mean in this context. That doesn't mean that you have to positively say that God doesn't exist, of course. My second note is to check out my moral argument playlist for those of you who are interested in the intersection between metaethics and philosophy of religion, and check out my playlist more generally. And then my third note is just an exciting note. Kane Baker from the channel Kane B, an amazing YouTube channel, I highly recommend it, and a meta-ethicist, Dr. Russ Schaefer Landau, one of the best meta-ethicists in the world right now. They're going to be coming on my channel to discuss moral realism. So that's an exciting thing to look forward to. So here's an outline for the rest of this video. First, we're going to be looking at moral realism and moral error theory, or just error theory for short. Secondly, we're going to be briefly covering what supervenience is, because it plays a role in the argument that we're going to be looking at. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at a philosopher named Christopher Coons, one of his arguments. Fourth, we're going to look at a problem afflicting Coons's argument, and then we're going to look at two different motivations that Coons gives in order to avert that problem. And we're going to evaluate whether or not they do succeed in averting that problem. So first, on to moral realism and moral error theory. Before I define moral realism and moral error theory, it's good to get a kind of lay of the land of ethics, right? So ethics is kind of traditionally broken up into three different sub-branches. The first is applied ethics. In short, applied ethics investigates practical, real-world moral issues. It tries to give answers to practical moral questions that we ask in everyday life. For instance, is abortion wrong? Or is polluting the environment ever permissible? Do animals have rights? And so on, things like that. Now, at a higher level of abstraction, we have normative ethics, which investigates what makes actions right or wrong. So it's not like the particular practical real world issues of whether or not like some particular action is wrong or right or permissible or impermissible or obligatory or supererogatory. It's not those kind of questions, but rather it's what is it about actions or about reality that makes them right or wrong. And so it's more abstract than applied ethics. It tries to construct theories that account for the rightness or wrongness of certain actions, motives, and or character traits. So for instance, we can ask in a kind of normative ethical domain, what makes both murder and stealing wrong? Is it just the intentions of the person who's doing them? Is it the type of action that they're performing? Is it the consequences of the action? Is it some combination of these? Is there a common ingredient to their wrongness? And can we tell a simple story, as it were, about why they're both wrong? So those are the kind of questions that you're going to be asking in normative ethics. And then finally, metaethics, which is the domain of this particular video. Metaethics investigates the nature and existence of moral facts and properties and claims and concepts and so on. So this is an even higher level of abstraction. It's even more abstract than normative ethics, because we're not just asking like what makes right actions right and wrong actions wrong. We're asking, what is rightness? Is there even such a thing as rightness? What is its nature? What are these sorts of moral facts and properties and so on? Do they exist in Plato's heaven, as it were? Or are they divine commands? Are they part of God's nature? Should we even be realists about these sorts of things? Are there no moral facts at all? So in essence, metaethics tries to answer fundamental questions about the nature of morality. What is goodness? What is badness? Are right and wrong real and objective features of reality? Are they just expressions of emotion? Do moral judgments really express beliefs? Are we capable even of knowing what's good and bad? And if so, how? Anyway, that's kind of the lay of the land of contemporary ethical theorizing and investigating. It's these three different domains. And yes, I recognize that this little e is lowercase and this big E is capital case or whatever. Deal with it. Like I said, we are in the metaethical domain in this particular video. And so there are two particular metaethical theories that matter for purposes of this video, because they're going to come up in Coons's argument as well as my criticisms thereof. So the first is moral realism. Moral realism, as I use it, is a tripartite thesis. It says first that our moral statements express beliefs aiming to represent moral reality. So that component is called cognitivism. The second component is that the truth value of moral statements is independent of anyone's beliefs or desires or other attitudes that they might have. In other words, it's independent of their stances. Whether or not something is right or wrong or good or bad or permissible or impermissible or obligatory or whatever, that doesn't depend on what we think about the thing or what we might desire. Even if we all thought that murder was perfectly fine, was a-okay, it's not a-okay. So in that sense, the truth value of the moral statement that murder is permissible, that doesn't depend on our beliefs and desires and so on. It's independent of those. It's independent of our stances. It's not made true by them. Its truth isn't dependent on them, and so on. The third and final component of moral realism, as I use it, is what we can call non-nihilism. Now, this is not nihilism in the sense of, oh, life is meaningless, life is purposeless, or whatever. No, this is non-nihilism in the sense of some moral statements are true. Some of those moral statements are, in fact, true. And so we can say that they are, in that sense, stands independently true, or what we might say objectively true. All right, so contrasting with moral realism is moral error theory, or just error theory for short. Error theory shares with moral realism the cognitivist and stance independence components. But unlike moral realism, we can say that moral error theory is committed to nihilism. According to nihilism, all moral statements are uniformly false. None of them are true. So all of them are false, regardless of whether or not we think that they're true, or regardless of our stances and so on. So that's stance independence. And they do express, moral statements do express beliefs aiming to represent moral reality, but all such statements are systematically false. So when you say that, oh, murder is bad or murder is wrong, like, nope. And so moral discourse is in some sense systematically in error. So the moral error theorist is going to deny that actions have moral properties. They're going to deny that some things are good and other things are bad, that some things are morally obligatory or morally permissible, because there are no such properties as those. All claims to the effect of such and such is bad or good or right or wrong or permissible or impermissible, all those claims are false. That is what that nihilism commitment is. Now, I should say this is kind of like a footnote, but sometimes added to moral realism is a fourth non-skeptical thesis, which just says that some of us know at least some of the moral truths. But for present purposes, I'm just going to set that thesis aside. All right, so that's moral realism and moral error theory. And so we are now on to supervenience. All right, so the general idea of supervenience, as you can see at the top of this slide, is that A properties supervene on B properties, just in case there can be no difference in A properties without some corresponding difference in B properties, right? So it's not possible. There's no possible world in which the distribution of A properties differs without the distribution of B properties differing. So some people think, for instance, that mental properties supervene on physical properties. What they're saying there is that there can be no difference in mental properties without some difference in physical properties. So you can't have, for instance, a difference in mental properties like mental states, let's say desiring something and believing something, right? That's a kind of difference there, a desire and a belief, without some corresponding difference in physical properties. Maybe there are different brain structures that undergird those mental states. Perhaps they functionally realize them, perhaps they cause them, perhaps they ground them, whatever. Moreover, the pixels that you're seeing on the screen here, those supervene on the patterns of electrical stimulation and so on within the computer or tablet or whatever you're watching this on. There can be no difference in the pixelation on the screen without some difference in the underlying electrical patterns of stimulation and whatnot. So that's a general idea of supervenience. Again, that crops up in a bunch of different domains, but we're going to be focusing on the metaethical domain here. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on two theses, or at least two theses that I want to get on your radar. So it's widely held that moral properties, properties like goodness and badness, rightness and wrongness, permissibility and impermissibility, it's widely held that these moral properties supervene on non-moral properties. So according to the strong supervenience thesis, which you can see on the left side of your screen here, the thesis says that for any objects x and y, and any worlds w and w star, if x in w is non-morally indiscernible from y in w star, then x in w is also morally indiscernible from y in w star. So if one thing is indiscernible from another, well, then it shares all and only the same properties as it. So you might think that there could be two indiscernible point particles, say. They have the exact same spin and charge and mass and velocity and so on. Perhaps they even have the same spatial location and whatever. That's what we mean by indiscernible. You can't tell a difference between them because they share all and only the same features or characteristics or properties or whatever. It's what we might call qualitatively indiscernible. Put differently, for any objects whatsoever and any worlds whatsoever, if those objects share all and only the exact same non-moral properties, well, then they're thereby going to have or share all and only the same moral properties. A still weaker thesis is what we can call the global supervenience of the moral on the non-moral, which you can see on the right here. This says that if two worlds enjoy the exact same distribution of non-moral properties, well, then they also enjoy the same distribution of moral properties. And I think that is relatively straightforward. Now, these theses are intuitively quite plausible. Moreover, they're very widely accepted in metaethics by both moral realists and anti-realists. Indeed, some philosophers have gone so far as to say that accepting these theses, or at least some kind of supervenience of the moral and the non-moral, is a condition on being competent with the concepts involved in morality. So consider the global supervenience thesis, the one on the right here. Suppose that in world W, it is wrong to torture babies for fun, and that Fred tortures a baby for fun. Okay, so Fred's not the kindest person, is he? No. So again, we've got a world W, and it's wrong to torture babies in this world for fun, and that Fred unfortunately tortures a baby for fun in this world. Now, Fred's act instantiates wrongness in W. Now suppose that we have a world that's non-morally identical to W, and we can call that world W star. So suppose, in other words, that Fred exists in W star, he tortures the baby in W star, he has the exact same history and future in W star as does the baby, he has the exact same intentions and character in W star, he performs exactly the same act, he does all the same things with his arms and his mind and his hands, and with exactly the same consequences, right? So the baby experiences just as much pain and just as much suffering and so on. It squeals just as much. Imagine that all of those non-moral facts are fixed also in W star. So it's the same non-moral facts in W as there are in W star. So now we can ask, is Fred's act in W star also wrong, right? So we're granting that Fred's act is wrong in W, but is it also wrong in W star? Well, the answer seems obvious, right? Of course it's wrong in W star. Nothing non-moral changed between these worlds. It would be utterly inexplicable and arbitrary if Fred's act failed to be wrong in W star, despite having exactly the same consequences and intentions and character and history and future and effects on the victim and so on. This inexplicability and arbitrariness isn't merely odd. Moreover, as Coons points out, quote, it seems impossible because it implies that the correlative demands of morality are arbitrary. End quote. Coons also argues quite convincingly by my lights that this arbitrariness is incompatible with morality's normative authority. That is, its ability to kind of categorically bind us and prescribe what we ought and ought not to do. But anyway, I just want to say that the supervenience of the moral and the non-moral is deeply intuitive. Almost all moral philosophers accept it. Of course, you're not going to be getting universal consensus in philosophy, even about, for instance, the external world, but these are very plausible theses. So with those covered, now we can go on to Coons's argument, okay? So now we are getting into the purported proof of moral realism. So where does he offer this argument or give this proof and justify it? Well, it's in a particular article entitled How to Prove That Some Acts Are Wrong Without Using Substantive Moral Premises. Again, it's by Christian Coons, and it is published in the journal Philosophical Studies, or Phil Studies for short, in 2011, as you can see here. Now, of course, he's using some pretty strong language, isn't he? How to prove some acts are wrong. And yeah, anyway, I doubt that. So let's go on. So here's his argument. And again, it's an argument for moral realism, making use of the supervenience of the moral on the non-moral. And just for reference, in this first premise, that's the supervenience thesis that we're going to be using. The argument can also be run using the strong supervenience of the moral on the non-moral, but for here, I'm just going to be using the global supervenience thesis of the moral on the non-moral, just because it's slightly less controversial than the strong supervenience thesis. Even though both of them are very uncontroversial in general, the global supervenience thesis is slightly less strong. It's slightly weaker in the sense of being more modest. So we're going to go with that one, and the argument can be run equally with it. So, all right, premise one says that moral properties globally supervene on non-moral properties, such that any two worlds with the same distribution of non-moral properties have the same distribution of moral properties. Premise two says that it is metaphysically possible that there is a world non-morally identical to ours, that is, with the same distribution of non-moral properties as ours, in which some acts are indeed morally wrong. And from those two, it follows that three. So some acts are morally wrong, in which case there are moral truths about such acts. So for the purposes of this argument, we can set aside non-cognitivism, as well as those who think that the truth value of moral statements depends on some of our stances, like whether or not we want to torture babies or something along those lines. So we're just going to set those aside for purposes of this. Right now, we're just trying to I guess, decipher between moral realism and moral error theory. And this argument, if successful, shows that there are indeed moral truths, in which case moral error theory is false. And for those who think that the truth value of moral claims and whatnot are dependent on stances, we can actually run the argument against people who hold that view. We could say it's metaphysically possible that there is a world non-morally identical to ours, in which some acts are stance independently morally wrong. And from those, you're going to be able to get that. So some acts are stance independently morally wrong, in which case there are stance independent moral truths about such acts. That would take us a little bit into the weeds because that assumes that stance independent moral wrongness is itself a moral property. I think that's plausible, but anyway, that would get us a little bit too much into the weeds. So we're just going to stick with the formulation as it is on the screen. Now, there's an interesting thing about the structure of this argument that I want you guys to be aware of. This first premise is what we might call the necessity premise. It's a premise which facilitates the inference from the possibility of moral truths or properties to their actuality. And that's because this premise is asserting a necessary connection between non-moral properties and moral properties, such that you cannot have two worlds that are exactly the same in terms of their non-moral properties and yet differ in terms of their moral properties. And so it's a kind of necessity premise. And then we have the possibility premise, right? We're saying, hey, it's metaphysically possible that there is in fact a world that is non-morally identical to ours, in which some acts are morally wrong, that do have some moral properties in there. And from those two premises, you get that, hey, some acts are actually morally wrong. There are actually truths about such acts. And what's interesting to note here is the similarity to the modal ontological argument. I have a video, a user's guide to the modal ontological argument that I recommend you guys check out. Of course, after watching this video, that is to say. But in the modal ontological argument, right, you have a similar structure. You have a necessity premise and a possibility premise. And those two get you to the actuality conclusion, right? You say something like in premise one, necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. Premise two, then you go on to say, hey, it's possible that God exists. And then you conclude by S5 modal logic that God actually exists. Now, of course, this argument here isn't making use of S5. Instead, it's making use of supervenience. But it's roughly the same idea. This is kind of like a modal ontological argument for moral realism. This first premise gives us a kind of necessity premise. It asserts a necessary connection between non-moral properties and moral properties. The second premise gives us a possibility premise. It's saying, hey, it's possible that a world has all the same non-moral properties as our world and also has some moral properties in there. And since there's a necessary connection between non-moral properties and moral properties per this first premise, it would follow together with two that some acts are actually morally wrong. But as most of you guys know by now, who've seen my videos and whatnot, the modal ontological argument suffers from a pretty serious problem. It faces a reverse argument, right? You can grant premise one and say, yeah, okay, we can grant the necessity premise because God, if he exists, would be a necessary being. Okay, fine. But you can just mount a symmetrical or reverse modal ontological argument. You could say, yeah, if God exists, he would be a necessary being. But hey, it's possible that God doesn't exist. And from S5, you can get from those two that God doesn't actually exist. And indeed, that he is impossible. The task then is to try to justify one of those possibility premises over and above the other, to try to differentially support the possibility premises. You need some kind of symmetry breaker, something that breaks the symmetry between those two possibility premises that seem on epistemic par. One, which is possibly God exists, and the other, which is possibly God doesn't exist. Similarly, Coons is going to be facing a reverse or symmetrical argument. This is the symmetry problem that I'm going to be raising against Coons's argument. We're going to use his exact same premise one, right? Moral properties globally supervene on non-moral properties, such that any two worlds with the same distribution of non-moral properties have the same distribution of moral properties. But look, we're just going to mount a symmetrical premise 4, which is symmetrical to premise 2, right? We're replacing premise 2 with premise 4. Premise 2, you'll recall, said it is metaphysically possible that there is a world non-morally identical to ours in which some acts are morally wrong. We'll just replace that some with no, right? It's metaphysically possible that there is a world non-morally identical to ours in which no acts are morally wrong. And from those two, you can actually conclude that no acts are morally wrong, in which case there are no moral truths about such acts. And that conclusion clearly is incompatible with Coons's conclusion. So we have two possibility premises, one which is saying that it's metaphysically possible that there's a world non-morally identical to ours in which some acts are morally wrong, and another which says essentially the same thing, but that other world is one in which no acts are morally wrong. Now, given the kind of symmetry between these, given that they seem to be a priori, or from the armchair, epistemically on par, we would need some reason to privilege one over the other. If we want to affirm one and deny the other, if we want to mount an argument with one and try to discount the other argument, we need some kind of differential support that favors one over and above the other. We need some symmetry breaker, some reason, some consideration favoring just one of the possibility premises over and against the other one. And so Coons is saddled with the task of symmetry breaking. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that Coons's symmetry breaking efforts succeed. And so we're going to be looking at the kind of first pass that he gives in justifying his possibility premise over a reverse possibility premise. And then we're going to be looking at a kind of second strategy or approach that he gives in justifying his possibility premise over the reverse possibility premise. Now, I should note that Coons doesn't put things in exactly these terms. I'm constructing my criticism around the prospect of symmetry breaking because I think that that's the biggest problem for Coons's argument, even though he doesn't quite fully realize and appreciate that in his article. But he nevertheless says some things that can be understood as attempts to break symmetry between them. So we're going to look at what he says there, and he gives kind of two different strategies. Again, we're going to be looking at the first strategy here, and then I'm going to be looking at the second strategy a few slides down the road. So Coons begins supporting premise 2, his possibility premise, with the conjunction of three common metaethical positions that serve as, quote, undefended assumptions, end quote, of Coons's argument. The first is that moral claims are truth apt. The second is that moral claims are coherent and that we cannot rule out a priori that they can be true. And the third is that no non-moral features of the actual world preclude the instantiation of moral properties. According to Coons, the second assumption supports the conclusion that there is a possible world where some substantive moral claim is true. By my lights, though, this is deeply problematic. I mean, first, it's doubtful that mere coherence supports metaphysical possibility, right? There are whole swaths of logically coherent scenarios that are nevertheless impossible, right? There doesn't seem to be anything logically contradictory about, say, waters being H3O instead of H2O, or the existence or non-existence of abstract mathematical objects, or the truth or falsity of mind-brain identity theory, and so on, right? And yet, water cannot be H3O. Abstract mathematical objects either must exist or cannot exist. Mental states are either necessarily identical to brain states or necessarily distinct therefrom, and so on. So to put things differently, metaphysical possibility is only a proper subset of logical possibility. Now, a proposition is logically possible just in case it doesn't logically entail a contradiction. That is, by dint of its logical form, it doesn't entail a contradiction. And an entity or an event or state of affairs would be logically possible then, just in case a proposition reporting its existence or occurrence or obtaining is logically possible. So again, Coons is trying to say that his second assumption supports the conclusion that there is a possible world where some substantive moral claim is true. He's trying to say that his second assumption supports premise 2, supports his possibility premise. But that is problematic because, firstly, this is my first response, again, it's doubtful that mere coherence supports metaphysical possibility. There are boatloads of things that are logically coherent, that aren't logically contradictory, that is, but yet are metaphysically impossible. Moreover, for precisely the same reasons that it's doubtful that coherence supports metaphysical possibility, it's likewise doubtful that our inability to a priori discover something's metaphysical impossibility supports its metaphysical possibility, right? Again, consider the water equals H2O example. Just because we're unable to a priori from the armchair discover that it's metaphysically impossible that water is anything other than H2O, that doesn't give us any reason whatsoever to suppose that it's metaphysically possible that water be something other than H2O. So anyway, that is the first of three problems that I'm going to be raising for Coons's first pass at breaking symmetry in favor of his possibility premise. The second problem that afflicts his first pass at symmetry breaking is that his considerations don't actually break symmetry between those possibility premises, between premises 2 and 4. For if Coons can help himself to the second undefended assumption, surely the error theorists, say, can help themselves to a symmetrical assumption. The falsity of all moral claims, that is, error theory, is coherent, right? That's going to be their assumption. And moreover, we can assume, or at least the error theorists can assume, that we cannot rule out a priori that they can all be false. Thus, even if coherence and our inability to a priori discover impossibility, even if those things support the possibility of the thing in question, they don't differentially support premise 2 over premise 4. That is, they don't differentially support Coons's possibility premise over the reverse symmetrical possibility premise. And again, that's because if Coons can help himself to that second undefended assumption, then the error theorist can likewise help themselves to a symmetrical assumption, namely that the falsity of all moral claims is coherent. So all moral claims being false, that is a coherent stipulation. And secondly, that we cannot rule out a priori that they can all be false. So how does Coons make use of the third assumption? Well, that's when I'm going to get into my third problem, because the first two problems were associated with Coons's second assumption and how he used that to try to break symmetry. And then this third problem concerns how Coons uses his third assumption to try to break symmetry. So now let's move on to that. So according to Coons, this third assumption allows us to conclude that substantive moral claims can be true in a world like ours. A world like ours, that just means a metaphysically possible world that is non-morally identical to ours. So again, according to Coons, this third assumption allows us to conclude that substantive moral claims can be true in a world non-morally identical to ours. By my lights, though, and this is the third problem here at the bottom of the screen, I don't think this is at all convincing. What is it, we can ask, for X to preclude Y? Whatever else preclusion is, the following is plausibly essential to it. If X does not preclude Y, well, then it's possible for X to be accompanied with Y. That is, it's possible for X to exist with Y. There's a possible world in which X is accompanied with Y. In that case, though, the third assumption of Coons, his third assumption there is simply question begging, right? The third assumption says that each actual non-moral property does not preclude the instantiation of moral properties. But given what's been said, this amounts to saying that each actual moral property is possibly accompanied by instantiated moral properties. And this, in turn, just is to say, in part, that moral properties are possibly instantiated in a world like ours, that is, a world non-morally identical to ours. And yet this is precisely the question at issue, right? Precisely what needs to be shown, not assumed, is that moral properties are possibly instantiated. But suppose we reject that non-preclusion entails possible accompaniment. Suppose, in other words, that it could be the case, both that X does not preclude Y, and yet X is not possibly accompanied by Y. Well, in that case, Coons's claim that the fact that actual non-moral properties don't preclude moral properties allows us to conclude that possibly there are moral properties in a world like ours, that claim there is simply false, right? We are not allowed to infer such possible accompaniment from non-preclusion. Coons's suggestion then is either question begging or false. I mean, I guess I'm going to note here, and this is kind of like a fourth bonus problem, appealing to the non-preclusion here doesn't seem that plausible, because there seem to be many metaphysical impossibilities that are impossible not in virtue of being quote unquote precluded by something else. I mean, perhaps there's simply something about the nature of moral properties that explains why they cannot be instantiated. This requires neither that there be some logical inconsistency in or among moral properties, nor that there be something non-moral precluding their instantiation. But anyway, that's a fourth bonus problem. Oh, and here's a fifth problem that is coming to my mind now. Coons' suggestion here doesn't even break symmetry, right? Again, if Coons can help himself to the third undefended assumption, well, then the error theorists, say, can help themselves to a symmetrical assumption. And here's that assumption. No non-moral features of the actual world preclude the non-instantiation of all moral properties. Appeals to non-preclusion, therefore, won't differentially support premise 2, that is Coons's possibility premise, over premise 4, that is the reverse possibility premise. Even if we granted Coons's suggestion and whatnot and ignored its being false and question begging, his third assumption there is not going to differentially support his possibility premise over the reverse one, because Coons is mounting an undefended assumption here, and if he can help himself to that, well, then the error theorists can equally help themselves to the claim that no non-moral features of the actual world would preclude the uniform non-instantiation of moral properties. And so if Coons wants to go from the fact that no non-moral features of the actual world would preclude the instantiation of moral properties to the claim that there's a world just like ours, non-morally, that has moral properties, well, then the error theorist equally and symmetrically goes from the claim that no non-moral features of the actual world preclude the non-instantiation of all moral properties to the conclusion that there's a possible world just like ours, non-morally, in which no moral properties are instantiated. And so that would support the reverse possibility premise. For Coons, however, the most important consideration in favor of his possibility premise is what I'm calling his second pass at breaking symmetry. This attempt at breaking symmetry just notes that none of the major concerns that detractors of moral realism raise, or at least none of the concerns that Coons surveys, undermine the metaphysical possibility that moral properties are instantiated in some world like ours. And again, remember that world like ours, that just means a world that's non-morally identical to ours or non-morally indiscernible to ours. Coons surveys several concerns that moral skeptics and error theorists raise concerning the existence of, as well as our epistemic access to, moral facts. According to Coons, none of these concerns, barring a few exceptions like Richard Joyce and I add Christopher Cowie, Don Loeb, and so on, according to Coons, none of these concerns, barring some exceptions, assert or have grounds for asserting that moral facts are metaphysically impossible. For example, writes Coons, when Mackey insists that moral properties would be queer, and when he laments that moral supervenience is extraordinary, he never claims or provides an argument that suggests that such facts or relations could not obtain. Finally, Coons argues that if error theorists felt they already had reason to indict the possibility of moral facts, then appeals to theoretical simplicity and explanatory power and debunking explanations of moral beliefs would be superfluous. From all of this, says Coons, it's safe to conclude that moral facts are metaphysically possible in a world like ours. And that, of course, supports his possibility premise. Now, there are at least 4 problems with Coons's argument here. First, it's just false that none of the error theorists' major concerns provide grounds for thinking that moral facts are impossible in a world like ours. For it is plainly true that many such concerns, if successful, do provide grounds for thinking there are no moral facts. But from the claim that there are no moral facts, it simply follows, given the global supervenience thesis that Coons himself asserts in his first premise, it simply follows that moral facts are impossible, right? For if they were possible, well, then they would be necessary, at least in a world like ours, as we've seen, and hence their non-existence and hence non-necessity entails their impossibility, at least in a world like ours. And so it is plainly true that many such concerns that error theorists raise, if successful, do provide grounds for thinking moral facts are impossible in a world like ours. With global supervenience in hand, any argument for the non-existence of moral facts is ipso facto an argument for their impossibility. Okay, so that's the first problem with Coons's proposed symmetry breaker here. It's just false, okay? In a 2013 article, and I didn't write down this dude's first name, so I apologize, but his last name is Brown, okay? So Brown, in a 2013 article, offers another way to see this point that I'm raising here. And he focuses in particular on the arguments from relativity and queerness from, like people like J.L. Mackey and Jonas Olson and so on. On the argument from relativity, for instance, Brown writes that if the best explanation for the diversity of moral opinions at our world was the one that Mackey gave, namely error theory, then this would also be the best explanation for the diversity of moral opinion at any non-moral duplicate of our world. That is, in a world like ours. After all, the only factors that we can consider in these situations, if we are not to beg the question against error theory, are the non-moral ones, which are identical in each case. Brown, like I said, also puts the point in terms of the argument from queerness. So he writes, if it was most reasonable to accept a debunking explanation of moral discourse at this world, then it would be most reasonable to accept a debunking explanation of moral discourse at a non-moral duplicate of this world. These debunking arguments, which contain within them appeals to simplicity, are not superfluous if we can use them to establish the impossibility of moral facts at worlds that are non-morally identical to the actual world. In short, Coons neglects that any argument for error theory's actual truth is thereby an argument for its necessary truth, or at least truth in all worlds like ours. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that even if none of the error theorists' major concerns support the impossibility of moral facts, this doesn't support the positive claim that moral facts are possible in a world like ours. The fact that no arguments support the negation of P is hardly grounds for accepting P. This would only be true if there were some defeasible presumption in favor of P as opposed to its negation. But first, Coons doesn't justify why there's a presumption in favor of the possibility of moral facts. And second, it's not clear why we should accept such a presumption. Perhaps the idea is that we should presume true mere possibility claims unless and until given sufficient reason to think they're false. But I mean, why should we take such a freewheeling approach to modality? Why not instead adopt agnosticism about modal claims, especially highly theoretical ones remote from our ordinary experience, unless and until given positive reason to think that they're true? Notice, moreover, that given system S5 of modal logic, the aforementioned principle entails that we should defeasibly presume true every hypothesis that would be necessarily true if it's true at all. Now, that is surely absurd. It is surely false that we should defeasibly presume both mathematical Platonism and its falsity, both theism and its negation, atheism, and so on. So that's the second problem with this. It doesn't even support Even if we granted what Coons says, which I said we shouldn't because it's false, that's the first problem. But even if we granted it, it doesn't support the positive claim that moral facts are possible. And that's what he would need to support if he wants to support his possibility premise, his premise 2 over and against the reverse possibility premise, premise 4. The third problem is that even if none of the error theorists' major concerns support the impossibility of moral facts, and even if there being no arguments for the impossibility of moral facts supports their possibility, this doesn't break symmetry. That is, it doesn't support premise 2 over premise 4. Just as Coons argues that error theorists' major concerns, barring some exceptions, only support at best the non-existence rather than impossibility of moral facts, the error theorist can equally argue that moral realists' major arguments, barring some exceptions, only support at best the existence rather than necessity of moral facts, and hence only support the actual falsity rather than impossibility of error theory. From this, the error theorist can then use Coons's implicit principle that there being no arguments for something's impossibility supports its possibility, right? The error theorist can use Coons's implicit principle there to conclude that moral error theory is possible. And so then we restore symmetry, right? We can equally well justify by means of Coons's proposed symmetry breaker here, the reverse possibility premise, in which case it fails to break symmetry. That is the third problem. And the error theorist can go about justifying that claim that moral realists' major arguments, barring some exceptions, only support at best the existence rather than necessity of moral facts. They can go about supporting that in the same way that Coons goes about supporting his symmetrical claim. What Coons did is he looked at some of the major error theorist concerns and basically just said, hey, like these are really only supporting the actual truth of moral error theory. They're not indicting the impossibility of moral truths and moral facts. Yeah, but okay, come on. The error theorist can go through the realists' main arsenal and say the exact same thing, right? Consider, for instance, Morean arguments for moral realism or against error theory. These essentially just say, hey, it's intuitively obvious that, some things are objectively or stance independently morally wrong. And so in the absence of super duper strong defeaters, we're justified in accepting that some things are in fact morally wrong, right? That's just saying that some things are in fact morally wrong or morally right. That's just saying some moral truths are in fact true. That's not indicting the impossibility of error theory. Again, right now, we are just parodying Coons, okay? I recognize that in my first problem that I raised to Coons, I said that that was false, precisely because justifying the actual truth of moral realism or moral error theory would ipso facto justify the necessary truth in a world like ours of moral realism and moral error theory. But we're setting that aside. Similarly, David Enoch's argument from deliberative indispensability likewise only supports the actual existence rather than necessary existence of moral truths, and hence doesn't support the impossibility of error theory. Similarly, Terence Cuneo's companions in guilt argument concludes only that moral facts exist, and hence that moral realism is actually true. Explanationist arguments for moral realism similarly argue only for the actuality of moral properties based on their actual explanatory roles, and so on. So again, my third problem for Coons's proposed symmetry breaker is just that it fails to break symmetry. The fourth problem for Coons's proposed symmetry breaker, and this is something that I didn't get into in much detail, but when Coons was trying to say that, hey, like what detractors of moral realism raise as problems for moral realism, that doesn't undermine the metaphysical possibility that moral properties are instantiated in some world like ours. What Coons said in justification of that was he saying like, hey, these guys, these moral error theorists and so on, these anti-realists often appeal to like simplicity and explanatory power in favor of their theories. But Coons says that appeals to simplicity or explanatory power in favor of anti-realism are superfluous when you already have a reason to think that moral realism is impossible. Now, the fourth problem here, which I'm raising against this particular claim of Coons, is that this is just irrelevant, right? Yes, it's true that appeals to simplicity or explanatory power in favor of the negation of P are in some sense superfluous when you already have good reason to think that P is impossible. But again, that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because appeals to simplicity or explanatory power in favor of not P can themselves justify P's impossibility or the claim that P is impossible. This is precisely what happens when we compare two theories, P and not P, say, each of which is necessarily true, if true at all, in terms of their theoretical virtues. When we compare atheism and theism, or moral realism and moral error theory, or mathematical Platonism and anti-Platonism, we assess their explanatory power and theoretical parsimony. Our assessment here is precisely what justifies us in accepting one theory over another, and a fortiori, it justifies us in taking one to be necessary and the other to be impossible. Now, note that I'm not here claiming that comparing theoretical virtues is the only thing that can justify acceptance of a theory. Rather, I'm saying that it is a thing that can justify such acceptance. But anyway, that concludes this presentation. I just want to give a bird's eye summary or bird's eye overview of it because, we got into the weeds at some points and it might have been hard to follow. And so I apologize about that, but I think it's rewarding if you follow it because there are a lot of different tools to be able to think critically and cautiously and so on about metaethics in this video. And so I think that those tools can serve you and they can serve your thinking and help you think critically and engage these sorts of arguments. But remember that we started with the global supervenience thesis. It seems really plausible that if two worlds are non-morally identical, well, then they're also going to be morally identical. If you fix all the non-moral facts about two different worlds, two arbitrary worlds, then they're going to be the same morally. They're going to have all the same moral properties as well. That seems really plausible. But once you grant the global supervenience thesis, you're going to open yourself up to the following argument that uses in premise one the global supervenience thesis and adds to it that, hey, it's actually possible that there's a world that's non-morally just like ours. It's identical to ours. And in that world, some acts are morally wrong. And because the distribution of non-moral properties necessitates the distribution of moral properties, and because there's another world with the exact same distribution of non-moral properties as our world, and that one does indeed have moral properties, our world is thereby going to have moral properties as well. That is the thrust of Coons's argument. But of course, we have that necessity premise there, the reverse possibility premise there, but we have a symmetry problem, right? Just as Coons can claim it's possible that there's a world non-morally identical to ours in which some acts are morally wrong, we can equally say that it's metaphysically possible that there's a world non-morally identical to ours in which no acts are wrong. And then we get a conclusion 5, which is incompatible with Coons's conclusion. And given that premise 4 here, this reverse possibility premise, and premise 2, the original possibility premise of Coons's argument, given that those seem kind of epistemically on par, right? One of them is just saying that there's a possible world just like ours in which some acts are morally wrong. The other one is saying that, hey, there's a metaphysically possible world non-morally identical to ours in which it's not the case that some acts are morally wrong. Given that there's a kind of epistemic symmetry there, it would be intolerably ad hoc to privilege one over the other, to assert one over the other without some kind of differential reason favoring one over the other. And so Coons owes us that kind of reason. He needs to break symmetry. What he did was he offered 3 assumptions and tried to argue that those supported his possibility premise. And no, they actually didn't. I gave 3 explicit problems here on the screen, and then I gave 2 additional problems. And then he gave a second pass at trying to break symmetry, and that one also didn't work. There were 4 problems afflicting that. So anyway, that's just a bird's eye overview of what we covered. And anyway, I hope this video, and by extension, my channel overall, helps you think critically and cautiously and with care and love and courage about the fundamental nature of reality. In this case, the fundamental nature of metaethical reality. And if you enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications. And if you feel so inclined, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I am a lowly college student, and your help is unironically helping me through college. And that in turn is helping me help you guys, helping me help you think about the fundamental nature of reality in a way that exemplifies the intellectual virtues, the moral virtues, and in a way that is philosophically rigorous. Anyway, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.